Good evening, everybody. Without further ado, I have the great pleasure of introducing you to Oonagh Duggan, who's BirdWatch Ireland's Head of Policy and Advocacy. Over to you, Oonagh.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. We're really delighted to be hosting this webinar this evening and to have so many people book and be interested in Ireland's seabirds. I just want to briefly say that also as part of the BirdWatch Ireland and BirdLife team here, I have Dr. Steve Newton. You've met Niall Hatch. We have Rochelle Streaker and Sarah Hegarty, as well as Jono Handley from BirdLife. So I'm delighted to have the team with me this evening. So I'm just going to share my screen now and give you an overview of what the talk will be about. So where the seabirds go, important areas for seabirds in Ireland. So this is just a brief overview of the evening. I'm going to give you a short introduction to BirdWatch Ireland and then just go over a little bit about why we wanted to do this work on identifying Ireland's important areas for seabirds, and then talk a little bit about next steps. Then I'm going to hand over to Dr. Steve Newton, who worked with BirdWatch Ireland for I don't know how many years now, Steve, maybe about at least 30 years, as our senior seabird conservation officer, who will talk about Ireland, why Ireland is actually really important for seabirds. And then we're going to hand over to Dr. Jonathan Handley from BirdLife International, who's going to go over the methodology of how we identified the important bird areas for seabirds. And then we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. So BirdWatch Ireland, I'm sure many of you know who we are. We are a charity that has our headquarters in Kilcoole, County Wicklow, but offices around the country. We have 34 staff members, and have 15,000 plus members in 25 branches around the country. We are funded mainly by membership subscriptions, by funds that come from tendering from projects, from grants that we apply for, and donations. We are very active in survey and monitoring and practical conservation work, as well as education and science and evidence-based policy and advocacy. Many of you will also be aware that we have a network of reserves around the country that we do our very best to make sure are as healthy for nature as possible. So identifying Ireland's important bird areas for seabirds. So Ireland already has, well, it has 145 IBAs, as we call them, and you'll hear this term throughout this talk. So the IBAs that we currently have that you might be really aware of are like Bull Island IBA or Special Protection Area, which was originally an IBA for waterbirds. And so many of these IBAs are already special protection areas. And for years, we wanted to identify our IBAs for seabirds. And finally, in 2023, we were having a chat with BirdLife Europe colleagues when some funding from the Flotilla Foundation was made available for us to embark on the identification of Ireland's IBAs for seabirds. So we were absolutely delighted because we'd been wanting to do this for so long. And so that started this project, working with BirdLife Europe colleagues and BirdLife International colleagues to identify these areas. So as you will hear from Jono, we identified 75 IBAs for seabirds. And now what we're calling for is these IBAs to be designated as special protection areas where they're not already designated. So there's 24 IBAs in the marine and 51 on land and in terrestrial areas. They would be breeding colonies. In addition to calling for these IBAs to be designated as SPAs, and the European Commission has a long history, as well as the European Court of Justice, of recognizing IBAs as often being a precursor to special protection areas where no other evidence is provided. We're also advocating along with our Fair Seas colleagues. We're a founding member of Fair Seas, and we want to we want government to designate a coherent network of marine protected areas to meet Ireland's commitment to 30% marine protected areas by 2030. Unfortunately, there's still no sign of the legislation on MPAs, which is really, really regrettable. But the SPAs for seabirds, or the IBAs for seabirds, if they were designated, would form part of that network. So that's where we're at the moment. So I'm just going to now stop sharing and allow Jono to come in.
Okay, so my name is Jonathan Handley, and I work with the BirdLife International Marine Program. The work that I'm going to be telling you about tonight was massively supported by our colleague Katha Auchincloss, who worked with BirdWatch Ireland during the project. And Katha led some amazing discussions with a number of collaborators across the Irish and UK Seabird community. So a huge thanks to everyone that really made this work possible. And for those of you who'd like to spend a bit more time reading about the details, tucking into the individual sites, understanding the methodology and some of the links, BirdWatch Ireland has this amazing display on their website, and there you can also download the report to read about what we've done in more detail, as well as to understand the consultations that took place and the many people that made this work possible. So we've mentioned this group, BirdLife International, and what we are by geography is the largest civil society organization for nature conservation. We have 124 partners in just over 120 countries, and we have one of those national partners typically per country working together to try and conserve nature, working with people so that people and nature can benefit now and into the future. And we've done remarkable work over the last 100 years, helping over 700 threatened bird species work towards proactive conservation measures. And by geography, you can see we cover all major continents. And so the lessons that we can learn across the partnership are really amazing and really help us to deliver better conservation results and to take those messages up to the global level, where we can talk to world leaders and decision makers at some of the meetings like the Convention on the Biological Diversity, where major government officials get together. The way we work at BirdLife is across 4 pillars: species, sites, systems, and society. And the work that we do is underpinned by science and led by the partnership. And of course, that is all wrapped up through looking at birds and how birds represent amazing places for nature conservation. And the work that we're going to talk about today, of course, encompasses all aspects of these pillars, but largely focuses on the species and the sites pillars of BirdLife International and the partnership. And when we talk about those sites, we're talking about these IBAs that Oonagh mentioned, or these important bird and biodiversity areas. And what these were an evolution of sites that came from the 1970s, where there was the Birds and Habitats Directive in Europe, and people were trying to find ways to identify significant sites for nature. And the BirdLife Partnership got together. They developed a series of methodologies, a series of criteria, and over time, we've applied that across a number of different countries to develop our global IBA network. And the really great thing is that when we're doing this, we want this very much to be a bottom-up exercise supported by global knowledge. So we work with locals who are on the ground, gathering the data. We provide that supported data analysis at a national level, and then we work towards considering those sites in the context of global biodiversity data. And this leads us to this global map of IBAs right around the world. So you can see the network is vast, and we have just over 13,000 sites for birds that have been identified around the world, and partners working in many different ways, working towards conserving these sites and ensuring that they can prosper into the future. Now, today we're going to be talking about seabirds. Oonagh mentioned a bit of background, but my summary of IBAs for seabirds is that when you think about seabirds, you might think about the seabird colony. It's a bit more obvious and easier to monitor, a bit more easier to count. And so naturally, we were able to look at where important seabird colonies were before we were able to look at where important sites are in the marine environment. So BirdWatch Ireland had done the colony work, And now we have this new opportunity to look at sites in the marine environment. And this is an opportunity that comes about because we have amazing resources these days that can help us understand where seabirds are going. And one of those leading tools are these animal tracking devices. You think about the blue dot that you follow on your mobile phone while you're getting around from A to B. We can essentially attach a tiny mobile phone equivalent onto the back of one of these seabirds. People have done it in a number of different ways now to work out ways that don't impact the birds, and we can uncover where they are going. And this is what the information starts to look like. Take this juvenile albatross in the Southern Ocean, and for the first time, we can start to understand how these birds are circumnavigating the world in exceptional detail, the detail that really allows us to look at where we need to think about conservation efforts and where we can best place the resources for our conservation efforts. And BirdLife International, with its partners over the years, have now developed the Seabird tracking database. This is a public database that you can explore, and you can work with the researchers who maintain ownership of the data. And it's really a super powerful tool that the Seabird tracking data and the Seabird conservation community has worked to develop together. And what it allows us to do is identify these significant sites for nature. Identifying these sites and analyzing this data can be a bit of a complex process. And many of the tools and the methods that I'm talking about today are explained in more detail in the Marine Megafauna Conservation Toolkit, which again is a product we developed with a number of partners and helps step technical people and project managers through the steps to go from raw data collection to final site that can be considered for an IBA assessment. So what do we need really to get to this point of a new boundary in an environment, a new marine IBA? Of course, we need to know what's there, so which species. We want to try get a metric of how many, and we want to know where the site is, so things like the animal tracking data. And when we have each of those, we can take a site and compare it against a certain set of criteria. And today we're talking about these IBA criteria. The BirdLife websites document these in a lot more detail. You can see on the right of your screen how the overview of all the criteria. But simply speaking, I like to consider the criteria in 3 different ways. So firstly, we're looking at when a certain proportion of a global or regional population are present, and those thresholds vary depending on the red list status of the species. And the red list status is a measure of extinction risk of that species. So when species have a higher extinction risk, then those thresholds are generally much lower. Also, we can look at the top number of sites in a country. So typically that number is 5. Or thirdly, we're basically looking at sites where there are lots of birds. And the number that was agreed upon by experts over the years has been 13,400 mature individuals. So here is the list of species that we considered, the 24 species. You'll see that 5 of those species are highlighted in yellow. And basically, for some of these species, the populations are really small. For some of them, the populations are really dispersed. And so for some of these species, it's harder to identify sites that qualify against the IBA criteria. And these are the 5 species in yellow. So of the 24 that we're talking about today, 19 species were sufficiently concentrated and in sufficient numbers to meet IBA criteria. But I just want to highlight that the other 5 species are all found throughout the network of sites and will therefore also benefit from being represented by the IBAs for the 19 species. And you'll see 3 other columns there. And basically those 3 other columns tell us a little bit more about regional assessments for species, and those enable us to consider different criteria for some of those species, like the top 5 sites for a species in a country. I want to really emphasize that the work we're doing, the work that we're presenting today, has been to try as best we can to give a national perspective on where there are sites, on where there are significant sites for seabirds across Ireland and Irish waters. And this national perspective is quite powerful because it allows you to sort of compare different parts of the country. So We've taken colony data from right around the country, and the points you see on the map are only the top 5 locations for different species. We've taken animal tracking data, and so you can see that sort of heat map of oranges to purples and black of where we have tracking data from right around the country. And Ireland has also done amazing work doing these extensive at-sea survey efforts. And again, we've been fortunate to have access to that data to look at the distribution of birds around Irish waters through at-sea survey efforts. So now I'm going to step through each of the ways we are considering data for seabird species. So everything starts with the colony. And in Ireland and across the UK, there was an amazing effort to deliver this book called Seabirds Count, and it is a census of seabirds from 2015 to 2021. It really is a phenomenal piece of work done by a huge network of volunteers and experts to try and count all the seabirds around the Irish coastline. And that gives us information of numbers of birds at colonies. Now, we also know that birds move from colonies into the marine environment. And they do this in a number of different ways. And so while they're moving from the colony into the marine environment, we can consider areas directly around the colony in the marine waters that can also be considered as IBAs. We're following methods that have been published in academic peer-reviewed journals, and there are a number of different ways about doing this. Simple buffers around colonies, buffers that have been masked by bathymetry, so kind of having limits on how deep birds move, or more complex methods also. Then for the animal tracking data, again, we use a tool called Track2KBA. This was a tool developed over a number of years through a number of workshops. And this tool allows you to take tracking data, and I'll talk through the 4 panels on the right-hand side of your screen. Panel I, you can see a whole bunch of different colorful lines. These are basically the individual birds' movements. Then panel 2, you can see these blobs of colors. And those blobs of colors are essentially the core areas, so the areas that each individual bird spends more time compared to its overall area. Then there is this figure, the curvy line with the 92%. And that is a test to basically look at, do all those birds spend time in the same place, or do they all move around all over the place? And if they all spend time in the same place, we can identify a site that is useful for site-based conservation. And then from those efforts, we get to that final area in green. And what I want you to notice about the final area in green compared to all the lines of tracking information is that the final area in green is much, much smaller than all the lines of tracking information. And so we're not trying to look at or identify areas, all the areas that the birds go. We're just trying to find these core areas that birds spend more time in. And then for the at-sea survey data, so these are flights all around Irish waters where experts are monitoring seabirds. And from these flights where they're monitoring seabirds, we get these maps of where birds are found in higher numbers versus lower numbers. And we can use that information as part of our assessment. So starting with the colonies, we have to ask this question of what is a seabird colony? Seabirds Count is an amazing resource, and you'll see 2 columns highlighted in blue, master site and site. If you look at master site, you'll see the Blasket Islands repeat themselves for the European storm petrel. And if you look at site, you'll see several different names in the gray shaded area. And basically, you can either look at where either one point of information or the group of points of information. And because we had pre-existing boundaries in Ireland, the old IBAs, we also had a network of boundaries from NPWS. We could say, do these points inside these boundaries sum up to high enough numbers to meet IBA criteria? Yes or no, as well as look at potential new sites outside of these boundaries. And so just by a few examples over here, if you look at the sites and you imagine each circle represents a point of information about seabird colonies, if you analyze the data at the site level, then you have individual points meeting criteria and some not. At the master site level, you can add them all up and they may all meet the criteria. And so we did the same thing looking within the IBA boundaries and within a set of boundaries from the National Parks and Wildlife Services. And so then we have to delineate these boundaries. So from the left, we have Irish spatial planning base maps, where we've used those boundaries to draw polygons around islands. We have, sorry, we have the Irish government layer that we've used to draw boundaries. We have existing sites which have remained the same, and we've just updated the species information. Or on the right-hand side, we had the orange boundary where we started off, and this orange boundary got extended slightly to the pink boundary to match a different layer of information and to link up with the marine site that was identified there. And this work for the colonies then led us to these 51 sites meeting criteria with seabirds in that Oonagh mentioned. 9 of these are new sites and don't overlap any of the existing sites. And like I said, this was for 19 of the 24 species, but the other 5 species were still present within many of these sites also. So this is a big table full of numbers, and I just want you to cast your mind back to that image of buffers around the seabird colonies. Now we're moving from the terrestrial colony sites into the marine environment. And if we look at the Atlantic puffin, highlighted in gray at the top, you can see in green there's a number max of 383. So that means those birds can move up to 383 kilometers from the colonies, and you might consider drawing a buffer of 383 kilometers around a puffin colony for an IBA. We think that number is too big, especially for site-based conservation, and so we tend to opt for much more conservative estimates for IBAs. And the buffer that we've used for the Atlantic puffin is only 4 kilometers. So 4-kilometer buffer around puffin colonies. And you'll see for many of the other species, the numbers that we're using are quite small. And this is what it starts to look like. You see the puffin example, the areas of lighter blue, small buffers around puffin colonies that meet IBA criteria. And then for the European shag, where the criteria allowed us to identify a top 5 sites for species. You'll see 5 sites with buffers around them for the European shag. And in that case, they were masked by bathymetry. So then for the tracking data, we were fortunate to consider tracking data for 4 different species, which for 7 of those species, we had sufficient tracking data for the IBA assessment. And again, we looked at data from all around the Irish coastline. Highlighting that tool that we used again, the Track to KBAR package, the little dots are all the information from the Atlantic, from the puffins, and the blue area is the area that we consider for the puffins around the salty islands for the IBA assessment. So not all the tracking data, but a core area from within that tracking data. So we had those marine extensions around colonies, and in some instances we had tracking data. And what we did was provide or produce a single layer for species that went into our assessment for the final sites. And this is what the map starts to look like. So you can see areas in blue, some of the smaller areas in blue extending out to the lighter areas in browny red. In blue, 10 species overlapping, and then the lighter areas with fewer species overlapping, but all of those different layers qualifying against IBA criteria. So then we had the ATSI survey data also. The ATSI survey data gives us an idea of animal abundance right across Irish waters, and we had to consider a threshold that we could use for the IBA assessment. And the threshold that we used in the end was this 1% threshold. So we only considered the highest 1% of areas from that ATSI survey data, and we used that as part of our marine assessment. And so this allowed us to produce these 3 layers: a layer from tracking data and seaward extensions, a layer for the summer distribution of species, and a layer for the winter distribution of seabirds also. And we could take all of that information and then combine it to try and look at areas that we might put forward for IBAs. And when you do that process, the map starts to look a little bit complicated. So you can see this area around the Salties, for example. We have a square box and another square box inside of one box around many more boxes. And basically, if you provide a jigsaw puzzle for decision makers, then this can be a little bit complicated. So it's easier to provide a fewer number of clear polygons that decision makers can then use for spatial planning moving forward. And so we go from our complex of boxes to a much more refined final map, one larger box around the entire area. And this led us to the 24 new sites that we identified for the 19 seabird species for seabirds in Irish waters. So all new marine IBAs for the map. So we wanted to try and understand what this information meant for broader decision making also. Oonagh mentioned those SPAs, and those are mechanisms to identify important sites for nature also in EU countries. And when we look at the network of sites for Ireland, that gives us 10.3% coverage across the Irish exclusive economic zone. If we focus on those sites that have only been identified for bird species, that threshold is just 1.6%. And then when we bring our IBA data into the mix, the IBA data alone would be 7.6% coverage of the exclusive economic zone. And remember, Oonagh spoke about that 30% coverage that many countries are working towards. So 7.6% lower than the 30%. But we want to compare and contrast. If we take our IBA data, so our sites in orange, and we add them to the sites in green, sites that are in the process of being recognized or already recognized by the Irish government, that would take us up to 16.5% if we consider sites for birds and other biodiversity also. And just focusing on the birds, that would take us up to 8.2% then, if we include our IBAs in orange, and these are recognized as SPAs, and including the other layers recognized by government already. So to summarize that, we've got IBAs for 19 of the 24 regular breeding species. 5 of those 24 species are not triggering criteria, but they are present at other sites. We found 51 colonies or terrestrial sites meeting criteria, with 9 of those being new sites. We have 24 new marine sites. And in terms of spatial designation, when we add the IBAs to the information for all nature, then we can increase the coverage by 6.3% up to 16.5%. Or when we add the IBAs to the sites just for birds, we have an increase of 6.6%. And this takes us up to 8.2% of the Irish exclusive economic zone. And I'm just going to close on a last slide here with an opportunity for Oonagh to recognize what some of these results mean more broadly.
Thanks so much, Jono. That was fantastic yet again. So as I was saying at the start, our big ask right now is that the seabird IBAs, and especially in the marine, that they be designated as marine special protection areas. And also where we have, there's an issue with some boundaries of SPAs, especially terrestrial ones. We'd ask for those boundaries to be revised, and for the species data to also be revised. In some instances, we found through our analysis of even some of the existing candidate marine SPAs that there's some species missing, where we from our analysis, we believe they should be included. We want management plans to be developed for all special protection areas, and for that to be done in an open and transparent way in consultation with relevant stakeholders, with clearly defined conservation objectives and protection measures necessary to achieve these objectives. And in addition, we would like to see avian offshore wind sensitivity mapping used to inform the strategic spatial planning of offshore renewables. And in fact, that's something we are fundraising for at the moment, is to develop an avian offshore wind sensitivity map. Many years ago, we did a terrestrial bird wind sensitivity map, which is hosted by the National Biodiversity Data Centre, which identifies areas of low, medium and high sensitivity of offshore wind to birds. Doesn't create no-go areas, but it does provide information and tools in the toolbox for good decision making. So those are our asks right now. We're working very hard on them all. But it's an exciting time in the marine when there is a lot of focus on marine protected areas now at the moment, which is good. So thank you, Jono, for that. And again, if anyone has any questions, please do put them in the Q&A now. But I think we'll go back to Steve Newton. Steve, do you want to start sharing your screen again? So now we'll hear about why Ireland is so important for seabirds.
Onto the species richness maps of the globe. Seabirds, the global context, this disproportionately rich area in Australasia, covering Southeast Australia, New Zealand, where we have at least 69 species of seabirds. If you think about it, the Southern Hemisphere has lots of albatrosses, has all the penguins, and quite a lot more petrels than we do in the Northern Hemisphere. But that's not to say we aren't that far behind in Ireland with our 44 species, of which 24 are the breeders, and about 20 others are birds that come here on migration or they spend the winter in our waters. So I can give some examples there. We have birds that would come from, the Balearic Islands. They would come out in the Atlantic and spend some of the winter in non-breeding season off the south coast of Ireland and the UK and Great Britain, and others coming even from the Southern Hemisphere, such as sooty shearwaters, great shearwaters that breed in the subantarctic at the other end of the Atlantic, come up into the Northern Hemisphere for part of their non-breeding season, which is kind of our late summer and autumn. So there's lots of things going on, and we have other Arctic breeders that come down into Irish waters as well. Most of my talk is going to concentrate on the 24 breeding species we have in this country. So this is the full list. It's a bit abbreviated from the list you saw with Jono in his presentation. But what I want to show here is the proportion of these species, of the North Atlantic population of these species, and in some cases, this is where there's a little asterisk after the species name, of the global population that are present breeding in Ireland. So we might as well start at the right-hand end, and you can see there we have a third of the North Atlantic's roseate terns breeding in Ireland. We'll come back to these. We have nearly a quarter of European storm petrels breeding in Ireland. These are in that case, it's the European storm petrel, I say a quarter of them in Ireland. And then down in the 10 to 15 range, we have Manx shearwater, northern gannet, European shag, and common guillemot. So for all those species, Ireland's incredibly important. Two others are pretty good, sandwich tern and razorbill. So the ones that are relatively less important, which means they have a much bigger range across mostly the Northern Hemisphere, are the two columns on the left-hand side, including Leach's storm petrel, shearwater, Mediterranean gull, and so on. And a lot of our very common seabirds, cormorants, black-headed gulls, herring gulls, great blackbacks, kittiwakes, and so on, and the other terns, common, Arctic, and little. So really, I'm going to concentrate more on the right-hand side of this table in the next few slides, show where these birds are, the sites they are using, and, to give you a little bit of the flavor what's going on. But before we get on to that detail, Seabirds Count book includes this amazing table. It just looks a total mess. But what I really wanted to focus in on is the column for the Republic of Ireland. Notice as you go run down that list, you mostly see a blue color with occasionally sort of buffy cream. There's only a couple of little boxes with red fill. And if you look at the key on the left-hand side there, the blue shading means seabirds are increasing. Buff shading means they are probably stable. And we have two little red boxes, Puffin and Kittiwake, that are red. And this actually coincides with the global red list status of these species. And these are the two globally endangered species that breed in Ireland, and they're also probably not doing very well in Ireland. But that is counter the trend for the vast majority of species, which are actually increasing or stable. And you compare that with Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland isn't too bad, Isle of Man, Channel Islands, there's so much more red in all of their species. So we're doing pretty well in Ireland as it stands. So I've just started a new census of puffins in Ireland, and we think this is a bit of an underestimate, that 14,000 pairs down there. So that number might get bumped up in the near future, and that's good news for our puffins. So quick summary table here. You can see the 8 species that I think we hold really globally important populations, which means 1% or more of the world population of a species. 4 on the left, we are incredibly important for. And although roseate terns were very important in a North Atlantic context, in a global context, our birds in Ireland are perhaps only reaching 1% of that global population. And I have to remind people that a roseate tern is probably a tropical or subtropical species, which is really at its northern limit in Ireland. And that doesn't negate the fact that we have some incredibly important sites for roseate terns. So I'm going to quickly move on to these sites. Okay, roseate terns, a picture of them, a very beautiful, elegant seabird. You can just about pick out that little rosy flush on the bird on the right-hand side there. Note they have sort of a jet black bill, pinkish breast, and they are very white, apart from the red cap, with fairly bright orange legs. They have some amazing displays. You can see that on the right, where you've probably got a bird here, probably a male, trying to impress another bird. A lovely long sand eel there. Hopefully they get it together and they would start nesting in one of our Irish colonies. So the 2 sites where these birds are, so when we start drilling down into the number of colonies that support these incredibly important concentrations of birds, we only have 2 sites in Ireland, yet they hold 1,800 pairs and 300 pairs out of a Northwest European population of 2,300. And really, those other 9% of birds are at one colony in England in the North Sea and a couple of sites off the Brittany coast in France. So we are phenomenally important for our roseate terns, and they're whatever we want to call it, the hotspot for roseate terns in Ireland and the North Atlantic is this tiny little rock off the coast of County Dublin, off the north coast, Rockabill. This is what it looks like from the sea, from the east. As you're approaching Ireland, it looks fairly inhospitable unless you're a cliff breeding seabird. And in fact, this coast of Rockabill is where most of the kittiwakes on the island nest. It's very much a cliffy side of the island. But if we look at the island from the western side, it looks a little bit more hospitable, and you can see obviously the store sheds from the lighthouse era and the accommodation block up in the background there. So it looks a little bit more friendly, and the ground a little less precipitous. This is where the vast bulk of our roseate terns nest, this sort of area that I'm indicating there. So just to put the human dimension to it, BirdWatch, we've managed this site since 1989. I can't do the maths, but it's knocking on for 40 years, yes, something like that. This is how a summer starts for us, going out to Rockabill, myself usually, and 2 or 3 wardens. We head out from Skerries with a boat full of food and bedding and equipment and whatever, water, gas, all the things we need for the summer. Get over to the island. Once we're settled on the island, we start trying to improve the place for the roseate terns and the other seabirds. So on the right-hand panel there, you can see us all our nest boxes, which we used for the roseate terns, being stacked up, checked, repaired, repainted, and whatever. And then they're put out around the island to attract roseate terns. I said that roseate terns are probably a tropical species, so we give them a little bit of a helping hand, and we try and cut out the rain for them by providing these little boxes. Literally, they're a foot square or whatever that is, 30 centimeters square, with a little door, and they happily nest in these, and we can pack them in at very high density on the island. And literally, out of our 1,800 pairs, we often about 900 boxes, and usually 90% of those boxes are used by roseate terns. So once the birds are in, a few days after we've got everything set up, the place looks very busy. So here are 3 of the species that the island supports. The kittiwakes I've already mentioned on the west side of the island, the roseates and the common terns nest on the flatter areas. Roseates where we put boxes. Common terns are not that fussy, and they will more or less nest anywhere. We have a small population of black guillemots and Arctic terns also on the island. The two terns are perhaps what the island is internationally important for. And just to give you a flavour what's gone on since we started in 1989, the beginning of the project, we had less than 200 pairs common terns and roseate terns. We have built that up through positive management, supplying nest boxes, managing vegetation to create more space for the islands, and protecting them from disturbance from people and predators. We've boosted populations, and I see both have grown phenomenally. Roseates up to about 1,800 pairs at the current level. Commons had reached 2,200 pairs, but they've increased a little in more recent years. And one of the things going on there was that the impact of bird flu a couple of years ago. So that knocked the common terns a bit more than it did the roseate terns. Still, a lot of birds, and an amazing effort by over 50 wardens and myself over nearly 40 years of management of the island. So population growth is the blue line. The red line indicates how many young each pair of common terns or roseate terns are producing. And as you see, as the population goes up, the number of young they raise tends to go down a little. There's something called density dependence. I won't go into too much. It's, what you want, lots of breeding terns or lots of babies. There's probably a happy compromise somewhere, but I'll move on. Our other site is Ladies Island Lake in Wexford in the southeast of the country. And it is the total contrast to Rockabill, which is a fairly marine site, quite a long way offshore. Ladies Island is a brackish lagoon. That means seawater gets in. It's a lake, but seawater gets in. It's quite salty. And in fact, the water levels in the lake are so high in the winter that the islands that the birds nest on are more or less submerged. So the left-hand picture there, we arrived there in April. This is what it looks like. The water level has just dropped. There's a lot of dead vegetation, a lot of mud, and it looks pretty awful. But within literally, it takes less than a month. It turns into an absolutely green haven for seabirds. Not only the rosy terns, we have about 300 pairs there. We have over 1,500 pairs of sandwich terns, nearly 2,000 pairs of black-headed gulls, about 60 pairs of Mediterranean gulls, a lot of common terns and Arctic terns as well. So it's an incredible sight, but it's very flat and very grassy and just doesn't look like a seabird colony at all. Bottom right there, it's the sandwich tern. I say it's the most important site in Ireland for sandwich terns. Now I'm going to switch to the west side of the country, and we're going to talk about totally different sorts of seabirds, not gulls and terns and whatever. Over in the west, it's the petrels and shearwaters that really dominate, and to a certain extent, the puffins. So a couple of shots here of Skellig Michael, big island on the left. I hope a lot of you managed to get out there and enjoy it, not for its Star Wars fame, but for its seabirds or for its archaeological interest. It's an absolutely incredible island, but when you look at it, it doesn't look as though it's going to be covered in seabirds. A lot of cliffs, but not that many white bits on them. You can see some whitewash down here. There are a few kittiwakes nesting down here near the pier. Most of the island is either solid rock or these sort of grassy looking meadows and slopes. And a little more detail on the right-hand side, that's what the slopes look like. It's actually not really grass, it's actually what is it? Silene maritima. What's it called in English? I can't remember. But anyway, you see a slope and you don't see many birds apart from the odd puffin sticking its head out of a burrow. But at this colony and most of the other colonies like it on the west coast, the Blasket Islands, Puffin Island, and others, they are transformed at night. This is when nocturnal seabirds come in and are active. So we have two species that most of our west coast islands are very important for. The Manx shearwater, this one, quite a large bird, nearly small gull size. This is really the Irish albatross if we had one. And phenomenal colonies on those islands on the west coast. Smaller numbers nest on the east, on the Saltees and Lambay, for example, but it's the west that is the main place for these. So the islands, which look fairly quiet on the seabird front during the daylight hours, at night they're transformed by thousands of Manx shearwaters turning from sea to their burrows, and also storm petrels. Storm petrel is our smallest seabird. It's the size of a sparrow, or the weight of a sparrow. It's got slightly longer wings and a slightly bigger body, but the same weight, 26, 27 grams weight. They spend most of their lives out at sea, but they do come back to land to breed, and the sorts of places they breed are in little crevices in the rocks. And actually up in the top left there, the tiny little crack in the rock, I've yellow chalk around it, and that actually is the entrance to a storm petrel nest. This is what it looks like inside, the bird sitting on a nest, which is just a little scrape in amongst the masonry of that wall on Skellig Island. So again, Skellig has perhaps 10,000 pairs of European storm petrels. Some of the Blaskets have even more than that. And altogether, remember, they add up to an incredible, whatever we said it was, 25% of world population on Irish islands. They're also very important. We had 14% of the world population of northern gannets. These all live or breed on 6 Irish colonies. You can see the little map on the right-hand side. We have Saltee, we've talked about, Lambay and Island's Eye. Here, unfortunately, there's a Welsh island here, Grassholm, in the map as well. The southwest, 2 islands, Bullrock and Little Skellig are our main gannetries there. A 6th colony on Clare Island in County Mayo. And it's a beautiful bird. This is our most important colony. It is Little Skellig, just a couple of kilometers from Skellig Michael, where we were a minute ago. And literally, this is what it looks like from the top of Skellig Michael. But when you're in close to it in a boat, you just see thousands and thousands of gannets, 35,000 pairs or so nesting on that island. Phenomenal place, and the deafening when you hear those gannets calling away. To the east coast, I'm going to cover some more general cliff-type seabird colonies. Lambay is an incredible place. It's probably the largest overall colony of seabirds in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, matched perhaps in Northern Ireland by Rathlin Island. They have the same sorts of species mix, a lot of kittiwakes, a lot of guillemots and razorbills, fulmars, gannets as well, and lots of breeding gulls, great blackback gulls, herring gulls, lesser blackback gulls, and so on. Lambay also has quite a few puffins, and perhaps I'm going to explain a little bit about a puffin project we're running at the moment there. But if we look at a typical section of cliff, you see lots of auks on the sheerest parts of the island, gannets on the top, and then you see a sort of more muddy, soily exposure area at the top, and this is where our puffins nest. These little soily areas, boulder clay areas, and you can see rows here with some puffins outside them. And what I've been trying to do in the last couple of years is to catch some of these puffins, to put these tags on, tracking tags on the puffins. Really what we know more or less where they go to feed when they're feeding young, to catch these sand eels and sprats that they bring back for their chicks. But we want to know where they go in winter. We have done this sort of work on Skellig, on West Coast puffins some time ago, when they revealed an amazing story in where the birds were flying in August over the Atlantic, over to the coast of Newfoundland in Canada, and they were exploiting capelin, a small fish, a bit like the sand eel, over there for a little while in the autumn, and then they moved back into the middle of the Atlantic and spent most of the winter south of Iceland. Some of the Skellig birds also went into the Mediterranean in the winter. But what we don't know is what the Irish Sea puffins do. So literally, we've just started putting tags on the puffins. I catch them in the burrow, and these, you can just about make out a little net there. Once I have a bird, it gets ringed, weighed and measured, a little bit of a health check, and then tag is put on a plastic ring on the leg that doesn't have the metal ring. And that tag will record the location of the bird once a day through the winter. The downside is I have to catch that very same individual the following year to take the tag off to download the data. But that's the stage we're at now. We're just beginning to recover these birds after a year out at sea. So literally the handling and tagging the bird only takes about 5 minutes, and soon they're off back out to sea, hopefully to catch more fish for their chicks. And I'm really going to just finish with a couple more seabird colonies that have been mentioned that are all IBAs that we have designated recently. This is part of Ireland's Eye, very close and very accessible for folk in Dublin. Incredible gannetry on the Stack, which is spread onto the mainland just beside it. A lot of auks and kittiwakes nesting there too, and shags on the more bouldery areas near the top. Lovely site, very easy to get to. Would recommend a visit any day. For those on the south coast, equivalent site would be Great Saltee. Again, very easy to get to, and an amazing plethora of seabirds nesting on those cliffs. Gannets, puffins, fulmars, shags, kittiwakes, the works. So I'm going to leave it there. I hope I've given you a flavour of some Irish seabirds, what they get up to, and why Ireland as a nation is so important for these birds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was really fabulous, and it was really great to put the faces on the IBAs, you know, to put the faces of the birds and what we're really talking about behind the scientific data and the analysis and the, I suppose, rather abstract kind of hope the abstract kind of boundaries around areas for them. And with the hope as well that we want to get these sites designated for them to make sure that they're have areas protected for them into the future that have legal underpinning, and that where any activities that would happen in those areas would be assessed so that they would have no significant adverse impacts on these species. But before I go on, we are at our Q&A time now, and Steve, just just to follow on from your talk, we have a couple of questions that are related, that are directed towards you, and then I have more for Jono, and there's some for me as well. So I'm going to work from the bottom up, and if folk can just bear with me here. So we have a question here. We have gannets in northwest coast of Sligo. How far do they feed to travel? Actually, that might be also one for Jono, might have it from the literature. But Steve, can you answer that? Do you know?
I don't know, and we probably haven't tracked gannets in that area really, so we can't be absolutely certain. But we do know from the colonies where we have tagged gannets that they have each colony has a very unique foraging area, and that they rarely overlap. So, for example, on the south coast, the foraging area for the saltee gannets lies to the south and west of the island, going along the south coast of the Celtic Sea towards Cork. Then they abut against birds that are breeding on Bull Rock, which tend to feed to the east of Bull Rock up to that part of Cork where the saltee birds go. Then further around on the Kerry coast, we know that most of the Skellig breeding gannets would tend to go maybe a little west, but mostly north. So these areas hardly overlap at all. So by extrapolation, Sligo would probably support birds coming from the Clare Island colony in Mayo, but there will also be maybe at the south end of some of the Scottish colonies. So birds from St Kilda would probably head several hundred kilometers south and almost enter Irish waters. And there's a big colony on Bass Rock and the Firth of Clyde in southwest Scotland. They could also be moving west across the north of Ireland into Sligo waters. That said, gannets don't mature until they're probably about 6 or 7 years old and start breeding then. So there are a lot of non-breeding but adult-looking gannets moving around our coasts. So it could well be they're non-breeders in Sligo because it is quite a distance to a large colony. So, but probably a mixture. Some non-breeders that are just moving around, checking out different colonies. The young birds check different colonies. They will probably breed where they were raised, but it doesn't stop them having a look at some other sites. So there we have it. That's that.
So fascinating that the birds have their own natural boundaries, and especially I'm interested in hearing about the saltee gannets going west towards that North Celtic Sea, into that North Celtic Sea IBA down there, which we know is a really important area for birds.
I'll just stop you there. If you remember the map I showed of gannet colonies, I said, oh, we've got a Welsh colony there. That was Grasholm off the Pembrokeshire coast in southwest Wales. Their foraging area is to the west of their island, which takes them right across the southern end of the Irish Sea, more or less to the Wexford coast. And I say, that's their space. So if you're at Rosslare seeing gannets, they're probably from Wales. They're not the Irish ones, which are further southwest along the coast of Wexford, Waterford, and maybe into East Cork. So
that is fascinating, Steve.
They have their dotted lines on the map, and we're drawing lines.
How did they know? How did they know? That's amazing. I have another question from Hannah Mole. Steve, and it's about Rockabill. And is there a risk of overcrowding when providing housing for the birds, or would there be naturally be that many pairs?
Yeah, what is natural, what is not? Yes, and I was trying to explain that a little bit. The downside of encouraging more and more birds to nest there is that there's only a certain number of fish in the sea within a reasonable distance of the island. And I showed the productivity, the number of young each pair raises has decreased as the number of breeding birds increase. So I think we probably have, and you saw from the graphs, we've kind of plateaued out a little bit. So I don't really think we can cram more in. And if we did, it would be at the expense of the numbers of young they produce. And I think at the moment, most pairs are producing about one young, which is enough to keep the population stable at that level. So yeah, I don't really think we can squeeze in any more. And the data in the graph only went up to about 2023, which was when bird flu hit us. So I explained the common tern population has dropped quite a bit. Roseate's not quite so much, but there are other factors like that disease that can hammer a population quite quickly. So, you know, having plenty of birds is no bad thing. You know, it means there's a lot of them there to come in and breed if there is an unexpected mortality event like bird flu or an oil spill or something. Yeah.
So actually, just on that topic, then I have another question from somebody here who asks, we frequently hear that seabirds are concentrated in colonies. Historically, were they more dispersed along coastlines, or were there more large colonies?
Yeah, I kind of get that. Yes, I think there were more spread out, but there were far less people, far less coastal recreation, and that sort of thing. So I think what we see now is a function of, we do of our management efforts, and I think that our little tern projects are perhaps one that explains this better. We used to have, little terns breeding on most beaches, sandy or pebbly beaches around the coast. But because of human pressure, the number of undisturbed stretches of beach have reduced and reduced and reduced. And we've had to intensively manage and keep out people and dogs and other predators, foxes and whatever, from those smaller number of sites. So we tend to have fewer, bigger colonies now than we had in the past. But the populations have gone up as well. But this is one of the conservation conundrums that they're concentrated into a smaller number of sites, dependent on human management. But that's the way of the world. We can't wind the clock back. We've just got to deal with what we've created to a certain degree. And obviously, the reason we want all our marine IBAs is to give them better protection and better management, to have a plan of what we're doing to try and, cut down overfishing or whatever it is that might be threatening the prey stock for a colony or a species. So it's better management of the sea, given there's a higher human population and a lot more going on in the marine environment now than there was in the past.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so I'm going to lose track of all the questions if I don't start from the start. I've just figured that out. So I'm going to start from the start because then I won't leave anybody out. So there's a question from Hannah about monitoring IBAs. Once they are designated, what mechanisms are there in place to ensure they are protected? And are there effective measures in place to make sure these are actually protected in practice? So that's a tough question, Hannah. As regards the monitoring, I suppose in one sense, the Seabird survey and monitoring would be, so once they're designated, the IBAs do not have any designation at the moment. They do not have a legal impact as they are. They would have to be designated as special protection areas by the Irish government to have that legal underpinning. So that's just in the first instance. This is the information that these are important bird areas. So once they're designated, then probably the most, like where the most effective management will really come in is in the use of Article 6.3 in the Habitats Directive through planning. And the assessment of activities. So that's probably the most likely place where, let's say, an enforcement side or really implementation of the law. But we really want to see management plans put in place. And actually, there's no management plans for any SPA in Ireland. And that is something that we have been calling on government to remedy, because it is the case that I think there's over a reliance on Article 6.3 and the Habitats Directive to manage for nature, when actually the management plans and effective, management measures would provide an awful lot more certainty to everybody about what are the goals for these sites. So if you think on land, it might be restricting dogs, which we know that dogs in some coastal SPAs can be, really problematic for water birds for causing disturbance. That there might be, other more positive as well management actions that could be undertaken. But so we really would need to see management plans and the use of Article 6.3 in the Habitats Directive, which would apply to that. And the monitoring then, I think, would come with the actual survey and monitoring that's normally done for seabirds. But we are, the seabird census, I think, I can't remember, Steve, how often that survey and monitoring is done for seabirds, that it should be a bit more frequent. They are long-lived species, so it's tricky. Is that correct, Steve?
Yeah. The big national surveys that Seabirds count was the last iteration. That was the fourth attempt we've had in Ireland to cover the whole coast in a shortish period of time. It takes us about 5 years to get around them, as you could see. We do those sort of surveys about every 15 years. So that's where we try and cover everything. But then we do annual monitoring at a smaller number of sites, including Lambay and Rockabill. There's quite a lot done on Saltee and on Skellig. So a lot of the sites I mentioned, they have regular, more or less annual monitoring. There are other sites we try to get to every 5 years, something like that. So other important sites, but it's constraints, it's money and staff and whatever to do it. So we sort of save up for those big efforts every 15 years, but we try and keep at least a decent sample of colonies covered, so we get a feel of what's going on from a year-to-year basis. That's the best we can do. We hope with more monitoring and management for both special protection areas, legally defined areas, as well as our IBAs, which we hope will become SPAs, that the government will be forced to do more regular monitoring, both at sea as well as at the colonies. And we have a new marine area regulatory authority that we hope it's part of their job to stimulate this sort of work. But it's not up to us. We'll do our bit.
Yeah,
but we're
absolutely.
quite a small NGO, really. So
yeah, we're doing our best. I have a question here for Jono. Yeah, Jono. Yeah, sorry. Would you like to add anything there, Jono, on that?
I was gonna sort of merge the two questions, but I think you have clicked one into the next Zoom room. But maybe just to say, because there was a second question about IBAs versus SPAs.
Oh yeah, that was just about the legal. Yeah, I thought I kind of half answered that when I was saying that. Yeah, the SPAs have the legal underpinning. Even though the IBAs have recognition by the European Court of Justice, in many, many different case rulings as being probably the foremost data set for the identification of important areas for birds. So there's a lot of underpinning there. Is that what you wanted me to refer to, Jono?
Not entirely. Maybe I was just going to add, from a global picture, we know that seabird populations are in decline, and a study that looked at all colonies monitored around the world has shown us that decline over the last few decades. In terms of IVAs in an ideal situation would get monitored every 8 to 12 years. And the IVA process also has a monitoring protocol that looks at state, so how species are doing, pressure, what things are impacting sites, and response, what can be done. And so that is a framework that can be used when these sites are designated as SPAs also to design the management plan. And then at a global level, I think roughly 10% of the ocean has, on paper, strict marine protection, but MPA Atlas, which is a really neat project, evaluated those, and only about 3% of the strict protection areas actually have proper management plans in place that are enforced also. So building the evidence base to enforce the management plans is going to be great. And in terms of monitoring in the future, there is some very impressive technology that is coming out there. We're seeing people do remote surveys with drones, and it'd be cool to see how that could be scaled for colonies right across the Irish coastline also and other places too.
That is really useful information, Jono. Thank you. We're just going to take a question now from Catherine Booth-Jones at the RSPB. If she's still with us, I'm not sure. And this is for you, Jono. She was asking, were there different behaviours within tracking data considered in the definition of the IBAs? So, for example, foraging hotspots, migratory routes, commuting paths.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. We deliberate about this question a lot. And I think this question in terms of seabird conservation has come, especially as we've been thinking about interaction with fisheries. We spent a lot of time thinking about interaction with fisheries. In the world of IBAs, we are sort of generally sticking to where do we find a lot of birds and where do we find a lot of birds spending a lot of time. So we don't strictly look at foraging hotspots or migratory routes. There was a recent paper that came out, Wood et al., that looked at the method we used compared to taking parts of tracking data and looking at foraging hotspots. And both methods found the same kinds of areas. What that paper also called for was when you remove the foraging area data, trying to consider how you might conserve migratory routes or commuting paths within a site or in a sort of broader network of sites. It becomes tricky. You know, what I was highlighting with our tracking data was we take all that tracking information and we try to narrow that down to find a specific area that we can put specific management measures in place. And where we're looking at broader distribution of birds, that's where sometimes the broader policy mechanisms can also be really helpful. And a good example there is bycatch reduction in fisheries. So we see these boats going out to sea, they're trying to catch fish in different ways. And with a few simple mechanisms, boats can still catch fish, but can reduce birds being killed in the backs of their boats quite significantly. And then you can have that kind of measure throughout an entire marine region. And I'll just close by saying we have looked at some of these more complicated methods, looking at the sort of dynamic Brownian bridges and incorporating that into what in our analysis is essentially a kernel density analysis, but the computational efforts of those at the moment has been quite limiting. So it's definitely a workshop for the future and something we'd like to consider more. But we're trying to work out how we do that with the huge amounts of data that we get at the moment.
Thanks, Jono. And Catherine has another question about the distribution of tagging effort. Was that taken into account when defining IBAs? For example, some colonies might be studied more than others.
So when we apply this track to KBA method, we have agreed on a minimum threshold of 10 birds being tracked from a particular colony. And so any less than that, then there's too low a tagging effort. And we had quite a number of data sets that were identified, and you can see that in the report. Within the report, also where we had those low sample sizes, we've identified colonies that meet IBA criteria, And those would be great places to continue future efforts for tracking so that we can bolster the sample sizes. But a minimum number of 10 birds tracked from a colony is the threshold that we've looked at in this case.
Okay, brilliant. So Louise, you've asked, is there a spatial data set available for the IBAs? Yes, there is. And if you go on to the BirdLife data zone, and you can request the data set in that way from BirdLife data zone online. Okay, so Susan has a question, and Steve might help on this. Given the decrease in Atlantic puffin in Ireland, is there a decrease? And I don't know if there is. Maybe there is. I can't remember. What is the position of BirdWatch Ireland and BirdLife International on the continued unregulated over-tourism on Great Saltee throughout the breeding season? Well, Sue, I just wanted to highlight this has been a great concern of ours. But last year, the National Parks and Wildlife Service has issued a contract for wardens to manage the visitors on Great Saltee. So we're very hopeful that those days of people getting too close to the breeding birds on Saltee are over. So it's a really great initiative from National Parks and Wildlife Service. It's long overdue, and it's very welcome. So hopefully that will be that. And can I just say, anybody who's a photographer out there, please keep your distance. We've found that photographers are one of the worst for getting too close to seabirds, especially on Saltee. So thank you, Sue. Steve, a question here from Diane Lonergan. What about Fanad or Malin? We see thousands of gannets, especially at Fanad. I'm not sure what's going. If was there no SPAs or no IBA on Fanad or Malin? I'm not quite sure. But Steve, do you see gannets up there?
Yeah, there are a lot of gannets up there, and they're almost certainly Scottish gannets rather than Irish gannets. But that's the way of the world. That's all one population. Wow. So I would say they're coming from St Kilda and from Bass Rock and a few other sites in the Hebrides. So Sligo is a bit of a grey area. There could be Irish from Mayo or further south. Certainly on the north coast of Ireland, there are almost certainly Scottish gannets using our waters. So it's a shared resource. Enjoy them.
Absolutely. So somebody's asking about pelagic trips near Dublin. You can take a boat to Ireland's Eye during the summer, and sometimes there's boat trips leaving from Dunleary also to go around Ireland's Eye, and I'm not sure about Lambay, that's a private island, but you can get out to Ireland's Eye. And again, we're wardening there for, to encourage people to be respectful to the birds when they're breeding. So that is that. What kind of threats do birds face out at sea as opposed to at colonies, and what means are there to mitigate them? Well, at sea, one of the things people might have seen in the last few weeks is the terrible pictures of puffins washing up dead on the French coast and in Cornwall due to the relentless bad weather in the Atlantic in January and February, which was so sad to see. And we know that at least one puffin that was ringed in Skellig Michael washed up in France. So some of the Irish breeding birds are affected as well. So extreme weather events are having a very significant impact. Well, a significant impact. I suppose climate change. Sorry, yeah, great, Jono. Yeah, climate change is also impacting on warmer waters, or prey species are moving, and so we see those kinds of impacts at sea, which is why it's really important that we cut emissions. And then on colonies, and Steve might go into this later, but there's rat eradication would significantly help at breeding colonies. Jono?
Thanks, Una. Yeah, you touched on some of the good points there. For those who are interested, also, you can have a look at the report, and at the end of the report, you'll see we've done a review on the threats to species, also based on some global information, not national information. But that review, in terms of marine, we're looking at bycatch, so birds getting accidentally caught while vessels are fishing. We're looking at energy production and mining also. So trying to understand how birds may be impacted by offshore renewable energy development. And we're looking at pollution. And when it comes to trying to understand what we do about that, it's best to tackle that at a species by species level often, looking at which species are impacted in which area, or also at specific threats. And so you can do specific analyses for specific activities to identify where the right type of management measures are going to be best placed. And the IBAs are really the starting point to try and highlight that process. And then, yeah, just to add to the invasive species, pollution and disturbance, again, things that we can try and tackle. But invasive species, I think were the top, or was the third highest threat to species in a global review done fairly recently for seabirds.
Brilliant. There's a question here, Jono, in relation to from Finn Davies on, or maybe it's for Steve, sorry. When tracking the individual birds for the IBA assessments, do you have any way to factor if their flight positions are influenced by fishing vessel presence when determining the areas of importance?
No, it's the quick answer. But that sort of work has been done, but you have to have real-time knowledge of where fishing boats are. And I know that this work has been done in the southwest of England, where they've had access to effectively trackers on the fishing boats and looked and track tags on the gannet at the same time. And they've looked at the relationship between the two. And yes, fishing activity does influence where seabirds go. So, you know, quite often they do get food by tagging along with fishing boats. But as Jono just said, they can get snagged in fishing gear and whatever. So there is a cost to hanging around with fishing boats. You know, it's a double-edged sword. You might get a free meal, but on the other hand, you could hurt yourself. So I say we haven't really done that work in Ireland, but it certainly has been done across the water in the UK.
Great. There's a person, Casper, I think, or I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, says, you mentioned that there's some bird species from your record surveys that are missing. Which species are you looking to include next? Please say eider ducks.
So eider ducks weren't on our list. I think
No.
it was the divers and the loons were some of the key species we were missing.
Yeah.
We did look during the process of focusing on this assessment for some of that information. And, you know, like others in the team mentioned, we had a particular project and a sort of particular set of resources or a certain amount of time that was available to us. And the data for the seabirds, the ones that we mentioned, is what we were able to analyze. And what I will say is that the IBA process is not static. When new information becomes available, we can consider that information, and it's always great to get more help and more resources from others to enable us to do that. We're a pretty small team trying as best we can to tackle a lot of information. So if people are able to summarize that data for us or provide us sort of clean versions of that information, then we can consider it easily and help.
If the funding is there to help incorporate it. So there's a lot of different factors at play there. I have a question here, Steve, about rats on Lambay having a significant impact on puffins. Have you seen evidence of this or on other colonies, and what can be done to address it?
Okay, rats, as I mentioned, are one of the biggest threats, particularly to those burrow nesting birds, the ones that are on or under the ground. We're fairly certain on Lambay they're having an impact on the Manx shearwaters, where the numbers are very low, probably 50 or less pairs in one small part of the island. Puffins, we're not sure. We're trying to work out, but where puffins seem to be most successful are the least accessible parts of the island. So, there's some big obvious areas where puffins hang around a lot, but our data shows that there are very few pairs nest successfully in those areas, and we're pretty certain it is the rats. We've had trail cameras out on these sites trying to watch what goes on at night because our eyes don't work so well, but a camera with a flash or infrared does help us. And usually the first thing that's active around a colony, the minute the sun goes down, are rats. So literally the first thing that triggers cameras are not puffins or shearwaters coming out of burrows, it's rats running around down burrows. So I'm fairly certain there is heavy mortality of eggs or chicks of Manx shearwaters and probably puffins. So it certainly needs to be dealt with. I'm part of a team that have put in a LIFE application to the European Union for funding to try and get rid of rats on land. So we hope we'll hear about that in the next few months. So it's on the cards. We're trying to raise the money to do it. It has been done quite recently on Great Saltee, and we hope that the numbers of shearwaters and puffins will bounce back from a lowish ebb on that island too. So, and a lot of the West Coast islands probably don't have rats, so that they are quite secure, and that's why I said most of our storm petrels and Manx shearwaters are on the West Coast, not on the East Coast, which most of the relatively small numbers of islands, most of them have rats. So our Islands Eye, Lambay, Saltee had rats. Hopefully it doesn't now. Dorky Island has rats, though we've tried controlling that. I say it tends to be a big issue on the East Coast, not so much on the more remote West Coast islands.
Thanks very much, Steve. So we have a question here from Olivia about offshore wind and on the East Coast. So her question is, given the scientific evidence along the East Coast on Rockabill, Lambay and Kish Sandbank and Arklow as being important breeding and feeding areas for our important seabirds, particularly red-listed birds, does BirdWatch Ireland believe it is compatible with seabird conservation to allow the combined development of the large offshore wind farms without fully designating these areas as SPAs and fully assessing the cumulative impacts on seabirds? Well, let's see now to break that up a little bit. So we have our IBAs. The government has proposed the Northwest Irish Sea SPA, which is fairly in line with our Northwestern Irish Sea IBA. And we have other IBAs along the coast and off the southern coast of Waterford as well. So we hope that the IBAs that we are calling for to be designated as SPAs will be designated as SPAs. And as regards the offshore wind farms as an activity, we definitely wish that we weren't where we were. As in, we support a kind of a national strategic approach to wind farm development. Our IBAs and the marine SPAs should have been designated many years ago, and there would have been a lot of clarity for any developers to understand what potential special protection areas there could be in the Irish Sea. What we're not where we'd like to be, and we've had developer-led offshore wind farm development on the East Coast. That said, we have been sending in submissions to the relevant wind farm applications as they have arisen. And so we just have to see now how the planning process works out. We really do need to have offshore wind. And if anybody thinks that we don't, that is not really understanding the really awful situation we're facing with climate change. But we are actively fundraising for an avian offshore wind sensitivity mapping tool, and for us to develop it with BirdLife International, so we can provide more information on how seabirds interact with wind farms and the different infrastructure and the activities, so that we can better target offshore, where offshore wind goes. And so we really need it. We really don't want offshore wind farms to be impacting negatively on seabirds. We want that to be minimized. We want to provide solutions, and we want to help protect the seabirds, because the seabirds are already being impacted by climate change. So I can't say, is it incompatible or is it compatible? There are some places where it definitely won't be compatible, and we really want to influence that offshore wind goes in areas where it's of low sensitivity. But that's not really where we're, well, on the East Coast, that is trickier. So let me just see if does anybody else want to comment on that. We just go on to the next one. There's a couple more questions here anyway, and we are over time. And I know we've all been had a very long day today, so we might start to wrap it up soon. There's another question about the South Coast DMAP and how is protection and designation of the marine IBA along the Waterford coastline being threatened by the proposed marine wind farm developments there. And there's another question here from Jack about the overlap between the South Coast DMAP and the IBAs. And is there any more? Well, we'll just take those two. So yeah, we got a bit of a surprise when we identified our marine IBAs and saw that there was a very significant overlap between the South Coast DMAP for offshore wind and our it's the North Celtic Sea IBA. And yeah, we do have concerns about that area. And we also have concerns about the Seas Off Wexford SPA, proposed SPA, that we've sent in an objection to that, a submission or an objection based on ornithological criteria that it's not large enough of an SPA, and that it needs to further extend west, or else or else the rest of the IBAs have to be designated as well. So this is a really, really concerning area for us. When SPAs are designated, economic interests cannot be included in the decision making. They have to be solely based. The SPAs have to be solely designated on the scientific evidence. So the question from Jack here, as well as asking how significant will the effect of offshore wind developments be in our breeding seabirds? Well, if you're really, like, if we plan this properly, we would hope, if government plans this properly and puts the offshore renewables in areas that are least sensitive for seabirds, because not all seabirds are impacted in the same way. They all act differently in the marine. They have different ecology. But we hope, if they're planned properly, that there would be minimal impact. But I'm assuming it depends. Yeah, it just depends really. A big part of it is on where the wind farms are proposed, but also on managing other activities, such as overfishing, and making sure that breeding colonies have thriving populations and are not impacted by threats there. So there's a lot of factors to consider. When do you think you can make the offshore wind sensitivity mapping layer available? Well, we haven't done it yet, Tom. So we will hopefully be hosting it on our website if it gets done, if it gets funded. But thank you very much for your question. Another question here from Dara. Could the eradication of rats from offshore islands significantly change the fortunes of seabirds? Is it being done on Rathlin It's been done on Rathlin, I think. How about Cape Clear? Steve, do you know anything about that?
We have talked about Cape Clear in the past. It's not a massively important breeding colony for seabirds. It's incredibly important for passage migrants. The great numbers of gannets and shearwaters, cories and great shearwaters and manx shearwaters that pass the island. Not many breed on the island. It could well be a function of the rats on the island. It's quite a large island with a lot of people. There's a lot of things going on there and a lot of stakeholder interest we'd have to assuage. It would be very similar to Rathlin, and there was a massive European funded project. I say it's still ongoing, or it's in the final phases now, stages. So, you know, it certainly would be an aspiration, but because it's not a big seabird colony at the moment, it would be hard to justify it if you're comparing it with Lambay or Rathlin or somewhere else. So I think, yes, given that BirdWatch has a bird observatory there, we have a long history of involvement there. It would be a nice thing to do, but I don't think it would attract funding. That's not to say it couldn't be done by local people getting actively involved in it. So wait and see, but yeah.
Oonagh, can I just jump back to
Yeah.
your last point on offshore renewables?
Yeah.
Just to say again, what the IBAs do is they give us an amazing map, a national picture on where we find a lot of birds spending a lot of time. And that particular area that we're talking about of the south coast of Ireland, we have hundreds of thousands of birds there, not only Irish birds, but also birds from other parts of the world. And so the IBAs give us the starting point, and the sensitivity mapping is really valuable because for seabirds, we're generally looking at collision. So can birds collide with infrastructure, or can birds be displaced? So do they not enter an area anymore? And then what's the impact? And when the teams are looking at collision and displacement, they're going beyond just numbers. Oonagh mentioned this, they're going beyond just numbers of birds, but they're looking at all the kinds of factors that influence things about how birds use the environment, things like flight height, where possible, bird size, all these kinds of aspects. And so the sensitivity mapping really is an amazing tool to help with understanding how birds might interact with offshore renewable energy development.
Okay. Is there any citizen science monitoring like for iWebs or CBS for seabirds? Steve?
For that. Yes, but it's not really happening in Ireland because we haven't volunteers. But if you're willing to volunteer, please get in touch with myself at snewton@birdwatchireland.ie. We can match you up with a colony and give you methodology for monitoring numbers and breeding success of seabirds. We would be happy to have people. It's not a project that has any real funding, but it would contribute massively to our annual monitoring if we can find volunteers. Every now and again, we do try and recruit people, but you know, it's quite a difficult task. You have to sit on the top of your colony and watch closely for quite a long period of time, but we're willing to help people get involved with it if they get in touch with us.
Yeah.
Directly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. There is a couple of questions here about data gaps in relation to our IBAs, Jono, and I think we need to just let people know that we identified these IBAs based on the best available information that we had. There are no data gaps in our assessment. We used all the available data that we had that was in the correct format that we could use. Jono, do you have anything else that you'd like to add to that?
I probably wouldn't phrase it as there are no data gaps. We used all the information that we could
available.
that was available. We largely wrapped up this analysis in May 2024. While we were looking for data, we consulted with academics, government, Irish seabird researchers, UK seabird researchers, and we had 2 public consultations. where we asked, or where we showed this is the data that we've got, and we asked, is there any other data that we could get our hands on? And then, like I sort of reflected on one of the tracking data questions, there are colonies that meet IBA criteria that don't have enough tracking data for us to identify marine sites. And so those would be some of the places that we could focus on next also to improve our knowledge about seabird distribution in marine waters around Ireland.
Right, okay. Odrig and others, I see your questions, and I'm afraid we are going to have to wrap up. I'm really sorry. We'll try, if you can pop your question in an email to me, we'll try and answer them. Odrig, please, if you'd like. We really need to wrap up now. I think, yeah, it's been a fantastic evening, and we're so grateful to everybody for joining. We will be making the recording available. Yes, hope you can bear with us. We're all flagging a little bit now here at this point. So thank you very much, everybody. And I just want to thank my amazing colleagues at BirdWatch Ireland and BirdLife International for being such a great team of people and an incredible support. And can I just also say, if you're not a member of BirdWatch Ireland already, please become a member of BirdWatch Ireland. It's really important to get the support from people. And also just remember, you're all advocates for nature. So just keep telling your politicians you want to see more nature, not less. You want to see them do more for nature. We're all advocates. Okay. Thank you very much, folks. We'll send down the links to the email addresses you provide in due course.
Thank you so much, everyone.